So, you think you're ready to publish your book, but have you gone through all the necessary steps? Hi, I'm Jim Reddy, and this is Indie Opinions. And in this episode, I'm going to talk to you about the importance of beta readers, or proofreaders. So, I use beta readers whenever I can, because I find them to be very useful. And I think that a lot of authors use them just in general, because they find them useful. Like, there's a reason that publishing teams have literally teams of people that read through an author's work and decide on whether or not there are grammar inconsistencies, whether or not there are mistakes in tone, whether or not the story makes any sense. There's a reason that published authors get teams of these people. And it shouldn't really be any different for indie authors. We should get beta readers. And I know one of the benefits of being an indie author is that you don't have to, but I would still strongly recommend it because I use beta readers quite a lot. I find them very useful in terms of, because I'm not very good at grammar, I find beta readers very useful for picking up on whether or not what I'm writing makes any grammatical sense, because I just suck at grammar so much. And it's also good for just at any point in the story you could use beta readers if you want to get a general idea of whether you think someone else would be interested in what you're writing about. Then you could send someone your rough draft and just tell them to not comment on like the grammar or the spelling or anything like that, or the plot inconsistencies necessarily, but just focus on whether or not they actually like the story and the characters, or whether they find it interesting. And if they do, then you can be like, oh, okay, good, and then you can keep going with writing the second draft without making too many alterations. But if you find that they don't necessarily like it, you could ask them why, and then you could get some constructive feedback on whether or not your story makes any sense, whether or not your characters are likable or believable, and then you can incorporate that into your rewrites. Now I know that a lot of the time editing is one of the biggest things of being a writer, and I do agree with that. I think it is a very useful to go back and edit your work, and as someone who's published books without editing before, I can tell you it's not a good idea. But even when you're editing, a lot of the time you can miss out on stuff. Like you can miss out on whether or not you think this makes any sense, whether or not you wanted to actually add something different to the story, like any backstory that you may have missed out on for a character that justifies their motivations a little bit more. But you just, in the moment, heat of the moment while you're editing, you just went, no, I can't be bothered to write that down, I'll remember it for next time, and just never do. Or whether or not it's a case of you seeing something that you know is spelt wrong, or just where you put a comma unnecessarily, and you pick that up, but you're just too tired or too like lazy and not in the mood to make those changes. But if you get someone else to check through it, they're not going to be as lax about that sort of thing if you get the right person to proofread. Now, what I mean by getting the right person is, I don't mean get any old person that has no interest in what you're writing about. I think ideally you should get someone who's interested in the genre you're writing. Like, you shouldn't really get someone who reads a lot of contemporary fiction and doesn't read any sci-fi to proofread your science fiction story, because they might not really know what's happening, and they might not understand like the tropes and the nuances of the story, because they just haven't read enough sci-fi of like quote unquote successful authors to be able to get an impression of whether or not what you're writing will be successful, or whether what you're writing will be well received by the people, or whether or not what you're writing makes any sense. So I think you should definitely get someone who is of the genre, who likes the genre that you're reading, that you're writing even. And getting someone with any like writing experience as well is quite good. Like I'm quite fortunate in my proofreading people I have available to proofread my work, because I have my girlfriend and she has a creative writing degree, so she's gone through the ropes and she's had actual published authors who were her lecturers tell her whether or not what makes a good story and what makes a not so good story. And she's very good at picking up on my grammar mistakes because she's very good at that. And I feel like that's when I ask for someone to proofread, that's mostly what I need. I mostly need like grammar checks, but I have also used it in a different way. I've used it in terms of, well, for my most recent book, Sapphire Sunlight, which is a mystery. I needed to know if the actual like who the villain was incredibly obvious or not because I didn't want it to be. So I needed people to read that and tell me whether or not they thought the villain was obvious, which they didn't. So that was or two on the nose, or if the hints were two on the nose and they didn't think that, which is good. But when I say get a proofreader, I don't mean get any old person from like the Twitter's writing community. As much as I appreciate that the Twitter writing community does exist, and I do use it, and I am a part of it, and I do use it for like, and I try not to writers cafes and help and talk to other authors as much as I can when I'm in the right mindset for it. I feel like just asking for like proofreaders from other authors, especially other indie authors, is a little bit not suspect, I wouldn't say. I'd just say that if you do this, you should be aware of the risk that they may or may not try to take your ideas from you. And given that you haven't wouldn't have published it yet, you don't own the copyright, so there wouldn't be anything you could do. So I'd say get someone you know personally that you know isn't going to steal your idea to proofread, and get people who like you know personally and you know that are good and you don't think will try and plagiarize, basically, is what I'm trying to say. So yeah, that's my thought on proofreaders and their importance. I don't necessarily think you need them, but I do think that especially towards the end of your writing, when you think it's ready, you should send it out to other people just to see if they like what they're reading, if they think it's sellable. It's quite a good one. Like I know before I said rough drafts is kind of a good place to send them, but also sending them when for your final draft when you think you've made all the edits and you think you're ready, they could read through it and go, you're not actually ready. This doesn't make any sense, and then you can sort of rectify that and make it so that the story is better, the characters are better. And I feel like proofreading, having a proofreader brings like a good book from a 9 out of 10 to a 10 out of 10 and and helps a mediocre book greatly by bringing it from a 4 to an 8. So yeah, that's just my own personal opinion on proofreaders. And now I'm going to go over to the writing community who, because I asked them via my Twitter, follow me at Jim Brady Writes on Twitter if you want to get involved in my pollings. I asked them, do you use beta readers slash proofreaders before you publish a book slash short story? And out of 9 voters, 67% said that they always do, 11% said that they sometimes do, and 22% said that they never do. So yeah, I'd say it's a commonly known thing that you should use proofreaders, but just for anyone who thinks like they haven't because they're afraid of other people's judgment or anything, I'd say just go for it. You probably have tougher skin than you realize. Anyway, that was this episode. I'll see you this week. Thanks for watching, and right on.